This video brought to you by Shopify.
4 lawsuits, 3 fake writers, drama, feuds, lies. Why is the Sonic comic of all things so controversial? How did a Sonic writer of all people become one of the most hated men on the internet? I saw so many misconceptions online that I ended up reading hundreds of comics, dozens of legal documents, decade-old forum threads, and ultimately decided I needed to interview the key participants myself. And this might be the most messy, ridiculous behind-the-scenes story of any comic ever. And it all starts with a corporate feud.
It's 1991, and Sega of America and Sega of Japan are at each other's throats. They've been clashing over the marketing of the new Genesis console, and Sega of America has been unhappy with the direction of Sega's new mascot, Sonic the Hedgehog. And so, when the first Sonic game comes to the US, Sega of America makes a fateful decision. They toss out the story that Sega of Japan had put in the Japanese manual and decide to give Sonic his own American backstory. And this decision is the first ingredient in what will make Sonic so interesting and so controversial. Because now, Sonic has no canon backstory. He's a character design, an attitude, a blank slate onto which fans, creators, and entire corporations will graft vastly different interpretations.
In case you need proof of this, Sega couldn't just make one show about Sonic. Through a tortured development process, they actually ended up making 2 vastly different shows about Sonic.
One is a lighthearted after-school weekday show, a low-stakes comedy in which Sonic loves chili dogs and cracks jokes. The other is an action drama in which Sonic is a member of a band of militant freedom fighters locked in a desperate struggle with a despotic tyrant who's intent on destroying the planet's ecosystem. But they don't stop at just 2 shows. They hire Archie Comics, known for comics such as Archie, to turn Sonic into a comic. Little do they know that this will become one of the most epic, insane, and controversial comics of all time. Now, this is a hot license for Archie, and they know exactly what to do with it. They hire the guy who'd been writing Alf. These early Sonic comics are deeply strange. You might think it would make sense to make Sonic into some kind of superhero, but these books are squarely funny animal comics, just loaded to the brim with painful puns. And yes, a big part of me loves it.
And because this is Sonic we're talking about, within 3 issues there's already behind-the-scenes controversy. The original artist on the series, Scott Shaw,
is working in advertising while doing Sonic on the side. For his advertising work, he's paid $10,000 per page. Archie is paying him $200 per page for Sonic. But Shaw is okay with that because it's a low-profile job and they're not printing that many copies. Except, without Shaw's permission, Archie begins using his Sonic comics as giveaways, apparently printing millions of copies and using his art in advertisements. He's furious with Archie and quits the series in protest. This is hardly the last time a creator will get into a dispute with Archie, but we'll get back to that. Scott Shaw may be gone, but Archie knows what to do. They hire the guy who's been drawing Alf. Look, it feels like what it is, a low-budget, tight-deadline corporate product produced by people without a lot of fondness or familiarity with the video game it's based on. It seems destined to only last a few issues and be lost to time, like so many other licensed comics. But that all changes with issue number 11. Reading through these issues in succession, the jump in quality in issue 11 is astonishing. In it, Sonic runs through a game-inspired dimensional portal and warps into a not very game-inspired alternate universe where he meets an evil version of himself. Look, I'm not saying it's Watchmen. I mean, there's a freaking maze in the middle of it, and it's pretty derivative, but it feels like someone finally sees that the Sonic comic has the potential to be more than just a throwaway gag book. By issue 17, they're delving into the unexplored backstory of this planet. It's still goofy, but you can see that they care enough about these characters to try and ground them in some sort of reality. So who's behind this massive transformation from disposable gag book to sci-fi action? Who is the savior of Archie's Sonic comics? A man named Ken Penders and his writing partner Mike Kantarovich. Now, hold on. If you know the name Ken Penders and you know where this is going, I promise we're getting there. But before we get to the lawsuits, to the hate, to everything that comes later, let's meet Ken Penders. Ken Penders just wants to be a good dad. That, more than anything else, seems to be his driving force in life. He has pursued a career in comics because it would allow him to stay home and be involved in his kids' lives. But before Sonic, Penders hadn't really quite found his defining gig. He'd shown promise as a penciler and gotten work at both Marvel and DC, and had even started taking on writing assignments, but he hadn't found the comic that would come to define him, that would secure his place in the industry. Then, one fateful day, Penders' phone rings. It's his writing partner, Mike Kantarovich, who'd been asked to pitch some stories for Archie's Sonic comic. Kantarovich doesn't know anything about Sonic, but he thinks it could be a good gig and wants to know if Penders wants to work with him on a pitch. And Penders is absolutely thrilled. Why? Because his son Steven loves Sonic. Steven has played all the games, and every night before bed, Ken and Steven read the Archie Sonic comics together. This is an opportunity to write on his son's favorite comic, a chance for him to be the cool dad. So Penders and Kantarovich huddle together and come up with their pitch. And Archie accepts. Their first work runs in issue 11, and then Archie wants more and more and more. Gradually, without knowing it, Penders is becoming the head writer on Sonic, and soon he uses his growing influence to make a pitch. He suggests to his editor that they move the comic away from the Sonic comedy show towards the darker, more serialized Saturday morning show. The editor agrees, and so Penders and the writers begin taking the ongoing plot more seriously, which is absolutely insane because it still feels like the different writers aren't even reading each other's work. I'm worried that you think I'm exaggerating, so let me give you an example. The book flips between things like this awesome 2-page spread of Mecha Sonic facing off with Mecha Knuckles to the 40-fathom freedom fighters facing off against El Capone and his hired muscle. This is not just in the same universe, it's in the same issue. Archie Sonic is like taking 6 different puzzles and dumping them together and still somehow making a cohesive image out of it. And it's Penders more than anyone else who's committed to making those puzzle pieces fit. Every single element gets a backstory. Like, it turns out that Sonic's lovable Uncle Chuck actually was secretly complicit in the robotization of Sonic's long-lost parents and had been living with the guilt and burden of secrecy the whole time he'd been whipping up chili dogs for Sonic. Look, I'd be lying if I said this all works for me. The book absolutely sags under the weight of its own continuity as more and more pages are spent with over-narrated flashbacks explaining lore that I didn't really need to know. But when it works, it's absolutely glorious insanity.
Look, I know there are those of you out there who will wreck me in the comments for saying anything nice about Ken Penders' work, and I'll admit, he's written some comics I really do dislike. But I'm also the guy who made a video defending Rob Liefeld, so I don't really have a reputation left to lose.
And while it might be easy to laugh at today, we have to remember how cool and unique this would have been to kids in the 90s. Kids media was generally simple, non-violent, and self-contained. But here's a book aimed at kids that took itself very seriously, that took its world building seriously. Oh, and it takes its romance very, very seriously as well. Penders and his collaborators had turned what could have been a throwaway paycheck gag book into something that was deeply engaging to thousands of kids every single month. But sadly, the fun wouldn't last forever.
So help our own country.
CNN site has...
It's 1995, and Sonic Mania is dying down. Sonic & Knuckles, the last great Sonic game, is already a distant memory, and as attention shifts to the upcoming 3D systems, it becomes clear that Speedy Sonic can't keep up with Mario. Archie breaks the bad news to Penders and the Sonic team. Both Sonic cartoon shows are going off the air. Everyone knows what this means. Licensed comics don't outlast the shows and toys they're meant to advertise. They know that any day they'll get word that their comic is dead. This is going to be rough on Penders in particular. He had taken on very little outside work. Sonic had become his job and his passion. And, of course, a way for him to bond with his son as they reviewed each issue together. But Penders and the team decide to go out in style. In the run-up to issue 50, Penders leads the team to create an unprecedented 4-part story arc in which they raise the stakes to epic levels. This story arc is the culmination of everything good, bad, and weirdly beautiful about Sonic comics. It's fully unclear if this is still even a kid's book. Dr. Quack is revealed to be a traitor, and the villains shoot him in front of his crying children. The lovable Down Under freedom fighters are found in prison, having been subjected to months of brutal torture. Sonic's girlfriend Sally dies in a terrible fall during the assault on Robotnik City, and in the final issue, Sonic succeeds in killing Dr. Robotnik in revenge for Sally's death. It took less than 5 years to go from chili dog jokes to the grim realities of armed opposition against an authoritarian dictatorship. I absolutely love it. They wanted to go out with a bang, and they succeeded. And then something funny happens. The call never comes. The Sonic comic isn't going to end.
I can't overstate what a big deal this is. Penders and his collaborators had succeeded where almost every other licensed property had failed.
They had justified their own continued, independent existence. And now, unburdened by games or TV shows, Penders and his collaborators would begin taking the book into all sorts of controversial new directions and begin planting the seeds that would grow into an epic legal showdown. Archie decides, based on Sonic's popularity, to split it into 2 books. One about Sonic, the other about Sonic's frenemy Knuckles. The editor gives Penders his pick of which to work on, and he chooses Knuckles. And it's here on Knuckles where Penders' work will become more controversial. Emboldened by his success on Sonic, he'll take everything that had worked on that book and turn it up to 11. In Sonic, he'd taken a comedy book and added a layer of seriousness that fans appreciated. In Knuckles, Penders would explore housing crises, racism, aging, and divorce, and perhaps most infamously, the Holocaust. He opens one issue with his own reworking of Martin Niemöller's famous poem, First They Came, without attribution, changing the words to Sonic stuff. First, they came for the hedgehogs, but I did not speak up, for I am an echidna. It's a lot. As I mentioned earlier, fatherhood is deeply important to Penders, so in Sonic he often gave his characters parents who tended to look just like their kids with a different hairstyle or outfit, and he focused a lot on these relationships. In the same vein, Knuckles' previously unknown father Locke and his estranged wife would become key figures in the Knuckles comic, often upstaging Knuckles himself. But not only would Knuckles get parents, he would get a grandpa, a great-grandpa, a great-great-grandpa, in fact there's a whole council of grandpas. Again, I'm worried you think that I'm exaggerating, so here's the actual guide to all the grandpas that Archie later published. This whole focus on fathers and sons peaks in one of Penders' most derided works, Sonic Live. In it, he writes a story in which his son meets Sonic and even puts photos of Steven in the comic. This obsession with fatherhood would become one of Penders' most ridiculed traits online. But to understand where he's coming from and the battles he's about to get into, it helps to understand Penders' own background. See, Penders had a difficult childhood and was witness to regular physical violence between his parents, which led him to a confrontational, estranged relationship with his own father. To escape home at just 17 years old, Penders joined the Air Force. After his stint in the Air Force, Penders returned and began his career as an illustrator. But soon after, he got a call from his mother. His father was dying of cancer.
I practically lived in the hospital after that. And my father and I, we came to an understanding. I mean, he told me things I had not expected to ever hear from him. And as time has passed, I have found myself missing the lost time.
His experience convinced him that he wanted to be a great father, the opposite of the kind of father that he had. This is why it was so important to him to get a job in comics where he could work from home. This is why working on his son's favorite comic meant so much to him.
This is why he would dedicate a whole issue to having his son meet Sonic, even if the fans didn't like it. In any other world, this kind of raw, autobiographical work would be a quirky black and white indie comic with a small but loyal readership. But somehow, Penders got a major comic publisher to publish it in continuity with their most popular comic, and that's kind of amazing. I mean, I do kind of wish we live in a world where we got Joe Matt's Transformers comics or Harvey Picar's Captain Planet. Because, well, yes, this isn't what every Sonic fan wanted. Looking back on it today, I can appreciate this deeply personal weirdness. But in what I'm sure comes as a huge surprise to you, this children's comic about divorce, parenthood, and the Holocaust was not a sales success and was canceled after 32 issues. So now Penders, who had grown deeply attached and invested in these characters, is sent back to the main Sonic book, where he will be forced to share writing duties, prompting a power struggle that will alter not just the Sonic comics, but all Sonic media forever. Now, I have another question for you. Do you want to sell comics online? Because setting up an online store has never been easier, thanks to today's sponsor, Shopify. I love independently owned comic shops and bookstores, and I also know it's been harder and harder for them to compete with the big guys.
While a lot of shops just choose to list their products on major online marketplaces, more and more shops are turning to Shopify.
Why? Because rather than being lost in a sea of competitors, these shops use Shopify to set up their own custom online store, easily putting together a customized look and feel that matches their in-person experience. And Shopify's tools allow small stores, independent businesses to compete with the big boys.
Shopify is the best converting checkout on the planet.
And with over 8,000 apps in the App Store, pretty much anything you can dream up, you can accomplish with Shopify. They also have Shopify Point of Sale, so retailers have the option of linking their in-store, online, and on-the-go sales like comic conventions into one unified system. Please support the brands that support me making these videos, and check out Shopify today by clicking my link at shopify.com/Matt with 4 T's. That's shopify.com/MATTTT. Here's the other thing to know about Ken Penders. The man is a fighter. Either because of his difficult childhood, his time in the military, or his fierce dedication to providing for his children, Penders is never shy about standing up for himself and his own interests, and would often come into conflict with Archie. His first big fight with Archie had come a few years earlier when he had vocally supported Dan DeCarlo when he had sued Archie Comics. In the 60s, DeCarlo had created Archie characters Sabrina the Teenage Witch and Josie and the Pussycats, as well as helping develop the iconic house style of art for Archie. But when, in 2001, he sued Archie for some of the proceeds of the upcoming Josie and the Pussycats movie, he not only lost his case, but Archie fired the 80-year-old DeCarlo. He died shortly afterwards, bitter and resentful. Penders' vocal support of DeCarlo not only put him at odds with the Archie execs, but would perhaps provide a template for the actions he himself would take a decade later. But now, with Knuckles cancelled, the headstrong Penders is going to be forced to share writing duties on the Sonic book. This is a recipe for disaster. But before we get to that, let's meet the man who would end up in Penders' line of fire, who had taken over Sonic while Penders was on Knuckles. Karl Bollers. Karl Bollers is the kind of guy so determined to work in comics, he would do whatever it takes. He had started as an intern at Marvel, gotten a job assistant editing on some books, had been teaching himself how to letter, and eventually he taught himself how to color comics, which is how he got a job at Archie. While he was the colorist, he had pitched story after story to the editor of Sonic, and eventually a few got bought. But then, as Penders is going over to the Knuckles series, Bollers gets the call. He is going to be the new head writer on Sonic, and he does not have an easy task ahead of him. Since no one had expected the series to go past issue 50, they really have no plan for what to do. Robotnik is gone, and with him, the main conflict for the comic. Bollers struggles a bit at first, but eventually finds a darker, more aggressive tone that really works for the book, pulling influences from everything from 80s anime,
Battle of the Planets,
Hong Kong action movies, classic superhero comics.
I was being dumped into this shared world universe. There were a ton of backup characters that were created, many not even by me. I wanted to respect all the writers who had come before, even Ken. Yes, Ken, even you.
But there's a portion of Sonic fandom pushing back on how dark things have gotten, and so Bollers introduces Benny Lee, a new writer who leaves sharing the writing duties, who immediately begins penning lighter, easier-going adventures in contrast to Bollers' own. Except that Benny Lee doesn't exist. Benny Lee is Karl Bollers trying to appease the Sonic fandom. It's worth mentioning that appeasing the Sonic fandom is becoming increasingly difficult. Again, because Sonic is such a wonderful blank slate, fans have very different opinions on what real Sonic media should look like. But over time, Bollers, along with his alter ego Benny Lee, really figured the book out and began taking it in all sorts of exciting new directions. But just as things are really getting good, Knuckles is cancelled, and now Bollers is going to have to share writing duties with Ken Penders. Now at this time, Penders was already in the midst of another feud with Archie. They had demanded that he reboot Knuckles back to the original Sega version. Penders, by this point, is deeply personally invested in his version of Knuckles, and told Archie that they need to fire him and find someone else if they wanted him changed. This is the man Archie is dealing with. He's not only a fighter, but a prideful man, dedicated to his vision and proud of it, however strange you may think it is. Eventually, the editor comes up with a plan to both keep Penders on the book and far away from coming into conflict with Bollers. Penders will write backup stories that take place 25 years in the future, where he can be free to do what he wants with the continuity, while Bollers will write the present-day stories closer to how Archie wants them. This solution will in fact only worsen the conflict between Bollers and Penders, but before we get to that, we have to take a look at Mobius 25 years later. This is perhaps the peak of Penders' unique storytelling sensibilities. It has very little action and even less interest in the characters from the Sonic games. There's little here that seems like a kid's comic. There's a lot of marriage and divorce material and pages dedicated to dinner parties. To be fair, one issue's title is a pun on the famous kids movie, My Dinner with Andre. The highlight, arguably, is Father's Day, in which Penders has Knuckles and his father Locke reenact the deathbed forgiveness scene Penders went through with his own father.
That was all pulled from my experience, with my father. After I did that story, I was in tears. That was the first time I just broke down, and I recognized this was something I needed to get out of my system.
Penders frequently cites it as his favorite among his own works. This is peak Penders, a story that is deeply personal and autobiographical, even therapeutic for its author, but which has only the most tenuous connection to the property that spawned it. But Karl Bollers isn't happy with this multiple timeline solution, for obvious reasons. How can his stories matter if nothing he does will impact the future version that Penders is writing? A fan on Penders' message board jumps in to ask him this very question. Bollers himself replies, stating that Mobius 25 years later is just one possible future. Penders blocks him from the message board. Things feel tense. And just as this battle between the two writers is coming to a head, a new editor with a new plan joins the fray. In 2004, assistant editor Mike Pellerito is promoted to main editor on Sonic. Apparently, the book is close to cancellation at this point, and Pellerito seems determined to do whatever it takes to get it back on track. I'm going to caveat here that I wasn't able to speak with Pellerito directly, and he's given very few interviews, so everything here is based on other people's recollections. While from what I could find, criticism of Penders' writing wasn't as harsh as it would become after his later actions, there was a portion of Sonic fandom pushing back on his approach. Lots of mysterious figures watching the action on big arrays of monitors. New characters were just old character designs with the different hairstyle outfit. Oh, and a lot of floating heads. But fundamentally, it seems they resent that pages and pages in Sonic's comic are taken up by an autobiographical sci-fi soap opera that has almost nothing to do with the games they love. And it seems that Pellerito is sympathetic to those complaints. He grew up with the Sonic games, and so he plans to bring the comic closer to the game continuity, and by necessity, away from Penders' vision for the book. His first move is to bring fresh, young talent onto the book. Sonic has been running for about 12 years at this point, and so the first crop of kids who grew up with the Sonic games are finally beginning to enter the workforce. His first hire is 25-year-old John Gray, who he pairs with Bollers for the epic Return to Angel Island saga. In it, Bollers uses Knuckles, Locke, and a number of other characters that Penders had created and makes big changes to the continuity, changes that directly conflict with the future Penders is writing in the 25 years later story. Penders would later refer to this storyline as Bollers' hissy fit. While we don't know what happened behind the scenes, the relationship between Bollers and Penders is likely untenable. Someone has to go. And so, after the Return to Angel Island arc concludes, Bollers is gone from Sonic, and Penders is back in as lead writer. He would say of this run, "When I resumed writing Sonic as a main feature, I made it clear I was aiming to correct the fiasco Karl had foisted upon the fandom." Penders would abruptly trim the storylines Bollers had spent the past few years building and quickly redirect things back towards his own vision. But just as Penders was working to erase Bollers' legacy from the book, behind the scenes, Pellerito was moving other pieces into place. Insurance against Penders. John Gray had been a success, and he was looking for more fans of the game to come work on the book. And his search for Sonic fans is about to lead him to one of the biggest Sonic fans on the internet, Ian Pato. In his real life, Pato is a normal college student, finishing up his English degree and trying to find a job so he can adopt a cat and get an apartment. But online, he is one of the biggest names in Sonic fandom. He's active in pretty much every corner of the growing Sonic internet community, including Penders' message board. Penders has even printed Pato's letters in the Sonic Letters page. But Pato's biggest claim to fame within the community is Sonic Other M. Sonic fan comics have become this big, wonderful scene in their own right, but most of them were nothing like Other M. Now, it's obviously amateurish and don't go read it. Like Pato, the artists were mostly in college or even high school, but there's a glimmer of something here. It's not what perhaps you might think of as typical fanfic. There's a serious dedication to Archie Sonic lore. It builds on the concepts of alternate universes that Penders had introduced into Sonic's world. But here's the other thing about Other M, which I think gives us some key insight into Pato's personality. While most fan comics would last 1 or 2 issues, Pato had published 30 issues of Other M, along with writing and contributing to numerous other Sonic fan comics. And over the past 4 years, Pato had been sending writing submissions to Archie. There's even a whole thread on his personal forum dedicated to following his multiple attempts to get a job there. Ian Pato has like shonen anime protagonist levels of persistence. But he's never heard back from Archie, and now it seems like his journey is about to come to an end. He's begun applying for real jobs, ones that will inevitably force him to leave Sonic fandom behind. But then he gets an email.
Because I had been so public with my desire to work on it, I thought it was spam. I thought somebody was trolling me and nearly deleted it and thought, I'll give it a read. And it's like, oh wait, no, this is legit. Panic! Joy, but panic!
Pellerito doesn't have a glamorous writing job for Pato, but he wants him to come on to write encyclopedia entries and research materials. Does he want the job? Of course. Just like the fateful phone call Penders got over a decade earlier, Archie was going to pay an enthusiastic creator to do a job that they probably would have done for free. But Pato is still determined to land that job writing an actual Sonic comic. So while he writes his encyclopedia entries, he shows script after script to Pellerito. But Pellerito is tough and isn't going to give him work until he's ready. But he's willing to give Pato notes, and Pato's receptive, sponging up everything he has to offer. Pellerito also apparently brings Penders in to help Pato grow.
He says to me, I'm thinking of bringing a new writer on, but he's not ready, for the main thing. I was just thinking of trying him out on a couple backup stories. Would you be willing to help him out, work with him? I said, yeah, sure. At least from my vantage point, I was trying to make things work.
Eventually, Pato's persistence is rewarded, and Pellerito approves a 6-page backup story. Pato's elated, but every time it gets scheduled to see print, it gets bumped. Pellerito keeps promising it will run soon, but Pato maybe feels like the day might never come. Why was Pellerito being so evasive with Pato? Probably because his plans to change Sonic's direction had finally brought him into open conflict with Penders. Penders' first 3 editors on Sonic had allowed him pretty much free reign, but Pellerito was a different beast. He told Penders what direction to take his stories, what characters to use, and was constantly shuffling work and giving him new assignments. This conflict between the firm Pellerito and an indignant Penders would produce, in my opinion, some of the worst comics in the Sonic catalog. The low point is probably the infamous issue 150. See, Sonic was always big into these anniversary issues. In issue 50, they had killed off Robotnik. In 125, they sent Sonic to space. In issue 150, they bring back evil Sonic, and he pretends to be the real Sonic to try and sleep with all the women in the comic book. It's implied that he succeeds. Hey kids, comics! Soon after, Penders gets the call from Pellerito. You know that kid whose letters you printed, who's been a huge fan of yours, who's been helping out on the research? He's going to be the head writer going forward, and you'll be on backups. This has got to be a tough pill to swallow, and the ignominy of being replaced by a fan has got to make him hurt and even angry. He takes a night to think it over. He's got opportunities in Hollywood, and he's gotten sick of putting up with Pellerito's demands. And so, after 11 years of architecting Sonic's comic universe, of pouring every element of himself into this work, Penders quits. He claims he tried to keep it amicable, but the Archie execs, for their part, would describe his departure as not very friendly. Now, this won't be the last time we hear from Ken Penders, not by a long shot, but for the time being, he'll be quietly watching events play out, on, I assume, a huge array of monitors. With Penders gone and his storylines unfinished, Pellerito has to scramble, but just as he's the villain in Penders' story, he would get to be the hero in someone else's. I'm sure Pato had a hard time comprehending what Pellerito was telling him. 8 months earlier, Pato had been a college student writing Sonic fan comics. A few weeks ago, he was crossing fingers hoping his 6-page backup story would run. Now Pellerito was telling him he was about to become the sole head writer on his favorite comic series. He decides to drop his pen name Pato and write under his real name, Ian Flynn. Flynn is nervous. He knows he's been thrust into the fire, and the Sonic fandom is not easy to please. And Pellerito isn't going to let him play it safe. Pellerito wants to reboot the universe, to wipe out all of Penders, Bollers, and everyone else's work and give the book a clean slate. Flynn, of course, wants to please Pellerito. He desperately wants to hold on to this incredible job that has landed in his lap, but he disagrees with him about rebooting and, despite his youth, stands up to Pellerito.
So I didn't want to start from scratch. I wanted to take these characters and stories that I loved and take them to their next chapter.
So Pellerito and Flynn compromise. He can keep working the existing continuity, but he has to very quickly clean house and streamline things. This decision could be blamed for what happens later, but for now, Flynn goes to work. He trims plot lines, he kills off characters. In the grand Sonic tradition, he uses wild sci-fi mumbo-jumbo to stitch the universe together. It's like an accelerated version of the same thing Penders did when he started on the book 11 years earlier. This puts him right in the line of fire for the difficult-to-please Sonic fandom. His work finally hits stands, and the online reaction is super positive. Flynn's work is an immediate hit with fans. Just as Penders had once been the book's savior, Flynn is hailed as the new savior of Sonic comics. Pellerito is apparently pleased and makes Flynn the permanent sole writer on the series, and so begins one of the most epic runs in comic history. This run will come to a tragic end, but before we get to that, let's actually take a look at what makes Flynn's comics so special, because I think a lot of people actually get this part wrong. The prevailing narrative on Flynn's work is that he was a huge Sonic fan, so he's able to make great Sonic comics. But lots of superfans have tried writing their favorite properties, and the results can be disastrous. But Flynn is not just an uber fan. Flynn is a writer. He's a lover of the English language, of literature, of theater. When I spoke to Flynn, he was polished and professional. He knows when to hit a soundbite or make a joke. But when we talked about writing and the works he loves, he rambled passionately in all sorts of interesting directions. I don't know if I've ever spoken with someone who lights up talking about the poetry of E.E. Cummings and then raves about Rob Liefeld and Executioner's Song in the same conversation, who celebrates the mass entertainment value of Shakespeare and Full Metal Alchemist at the same time, who raves about the world building in Vonnegut and Stephen King's Dark Tower. He can reconcile high art and low art, craft and fandom, and that is what makes him so perfect for Sonic. This is Ian Flynn talking about the Sonic comics he had grown up on, work by Ken Penders and Karl Bollers.
There were these big, sweeping, melodramatic stories with large casts, with lots of interconnected relationships and conspiracies, and these larger-than-life, memorable characters. And I feel like you can draw parallels to Shakespearean structure.
This is a guy who spent 4 years studying Shakespeare, comparing Sonic comics to Shakespeare. But his literary appetites are just one half of the puzzle for Flynn. The other is theater. Flynn grew up in a theatrical household. His grandparents were actors, and his father was an actor. Flynn himself was big into theater in high school, but didn't want to commit himself to the grueling life of an actor. But when Flynn writes, he acts. He was a student of method acting, where instead of building a performance through active performance choices, the actor seeks to truly understand and become that character, and let the performance choices flow naturally from their embodiment of that character. And Flynn brings that approach of method acting to his writing. He becomes the character. He speaks in their voice.
I tell you, Doc, I feel like I'm going crazy. It's like there's a bunch of voices in my head, man. You may think me daft, but after a hard day's night, I can't close me smiling Irish eyes.
This approach makes his work feel grounded, realistic, and authentic. But it's Sonic, so yes, I'm talking about the realistic, authentic voice of the tragically roboticized Tommy the Turtle. Now, in many ways, and reductively, the Penders approach and the Flynn approach are opposites. Penders is a world builder, chucking new and disparate ideas from a vast array of influences together and using his imagination to make it all work. Flynn is a character writer, deeply concerned with the voices and motivations of his characters. Penders puts himself in his work, pouring his own thinly veiled traumas, hopes, and fears onto the page. Flynn, by contrast, disappears. He tries to hide himself and let the characters speak their own truths. Both of them would probably cringe to hear me say this, but what makes Archie Sonic so special is the merging of these two styles. Penders and his collaborators had created this huge, diverse world with lots of interesting characters, but had never delved deeply into their personalities. Then Flynn comes along and breathes life into these characters, makes this world feel real, cohesive, and lived in. For me, as a fan of both, it's not Penders versus Flynn, but Penders and Flynn, which makes what happens next extra sad to me, because Flynn, Yardley, and a growing list of very talented collaborators had spent 6 years contributing hundreds of issues of stories and lore and a grand tradition that had been unbroken since 1992, and all of that work was about to come to a screeching halt. Penders is mostly quiet during this period, and I can only imagine what he's feeling as he watches this all play out. Once, he had been hailed as the savior of the Sonic comics, but memories are short, especially in those early days of the internet. And now here's Ian Flynn, a kid, 24 years his junior, a super fan of his work, being hailed as the savior of Sonic. Not only the savior of Sonic, but the savior of the Sonic comics from him. Penders had poured 11 years of his life into Sonic, put his most personal stories into the book, only for the editors and the fandom that had once embraced him to toss him aside for the younger model. After quitting the comic, Penders had tried to stay involved with Sonic. He had been working as a storyboard artist on shows like King of the Hill while working on his pitch for a Sonic movie. He'd been working on that pitch with Sonic executive Robert Loeffler, but sadly, Loeffler passed away suddenly in 2008, and Loeffler's replacement at Sega stopped responding to Penders. Not only is his Sonic movie dead, not only is he watching Ian Flynn gain fame and respect, but his finances are deteriorating. Soon, he'll have less than $500 left in his bank account, and as his bank account drains, he feels like he's watching others get rich off of his creativity. Archie is reprinting his Sonic stories in trade paperbacks and not paying him the reprint fees he feels he's owed. He feels Flynn is building a reputation off the groundwork he laid. He resents Flynn for not rebooting the continuity. He feels that 2 of Flynn's stories are directly based on scripts he had submitted to Archie before quitting without any credit or compensation.
Ian can say whatever he wants, but I know that his story tracks with the 2 scripts I turned in to Mike Pellerito.
And as we know with Penders, Sonic is about more than finances to him.
He absolutely did not understand the relationship of Knuckles and his father, and that I was extremely bothered by.
To top it all off, in 2008, Flynn kills off Locke, Penders' stand-in for his own father, thus making his 25 Years Later saga, Locke's deathbed confession and reconciliation issue, all non-canon. But the last straw comes later that same year. Fans start messaging Penders, asking him about his involvement in the latest Sonic game, Sonic Chronicles: The Dark Brotherhood. So Penders checks it out. There are characters and elements in the game that, to Penders, seem heavily inspired by his work on the comic.
Now, I know a lot of people take issue with that claim, but I do think it's important to view it in the context of the developer diary that was published at that time.
The world of Sonic is much broader and richer than most people realize. I mean, there's a lot of folks that are, of course, fans. You know, there's a lot there. So it was a great chance for us actually to look at this huge bunch of stuff and pick really cool things.
That's a Ken Penders Archie comic right there. He had stayed quiet, but this was too much, and so he makes a fateful decision. He calls his lawyer. And so begins one of the most insane, dramatic legal sagas in the history of comics.
Now, a quick simplified legal overview before we dive in. When anyone makes a creative work, they own the copyright to that work. The only way that changes is if they sign a contract stating that it's work made for hire. That's why it's standard practice in big comics to have creators sign work for hire agreements before they start working.
That's why Marvel owns Thanos and not Jim Starlin. So here's where it gets interesting. Penders has no recollection of signing a work for hire agreement. He believes Archie paid him only for the right to print his work once, not for the ownership of his copyright. To confirm his recollection, he surreptitiously emails the Archie execs asking for copies of his work for hire contracts. He follows up with a phone call. He would later claim that on that call, the Archie executives told him that no such contracts exist. The Archie exec would later emphatically deny saying that. Either way, after a number of calls and emails, no one had produced any contracts of his. Assuming they don't exist, Penders begins filing all of his Sonic works with the US Copyright Office.
Now, this is not a small task. It takes months of filing and organization, back and forth conversations with the Copyright Office.
They want to be sure that these claims are legitimate, so they send a notice to Archie giving them an opportunity to contest Penders' filings. Archie never replies.
Why did Archie not reply? And what becomes kind of a theme here, it seems like Archie has not great attorneys. And so,
in the absence of any opposition, Penders is granted the copyright to 173 works. Now, let's be clear, these copyrights are only worth so much to Penders himself. His work is derivative, in the legal sense, of existing work. He doesn't own Sonic, he doesn't own Knuckles, he doesn't own the characters that originated in the cartoon show. He can't republish these comics himself because they contain characters and ideas whose copyrights belong to Sega or Archie. The main party who could benefit from Penders' characters is Archie themselves. And so, on July 2nd, 2010, his attorney sends a demand letter to Archie Comics, including all of his copyrights. In the letter, he claims they've been reprinting his stories without payment and creating games based on his work without compensation. He wants to be paid, and he wants them to keep paying him to keep using his characters and concepts.
Now, a lot of people online paint this as Penders vindictively trying to shut down Archie in revenge for firing him, but given his financial situation, it could just be about a payday. We don't know.
What we do know is that Archie responds by sending Penders copies of 2 work-for-hire contracts he had signed in 1996. Case closed. But Penders isn't satisfied. He asks to see the original copies of the contract. He's adamant that he has no recollection of signing anything like that. Archie responds that they would try and find the originals, but it's been 13 years and they weren't sure where they were. More to the point, whether they are originals or photocopies doesn't matter in the eyes of the law. He had signed those contracts and they clearly state that this is work made for hire. And then, in his next letter, Penders makes a very strong claim. He accuses Archie of forging his signature on those contracts. In response, Archie sues him. Penders himself would file 2 lawsuits against Sega and BioWare for copyright infringement in the Dark Brotherhood, but the judge would dismiss them until Penders had resolved his fight with Archie. The battle for the future of Sonic between Archie and Penders had begun. They meet to try and settle the matter without going to trial. Archie has a 5-figure number in mind. Penders' team counters with a 7-figure number. They walk away from the negotiating table without making any progress. They're going to fight it out.
No, there's a lot of legal technicalities, but the case really turned on a simple point. Were the contracts real, or were they forgeries? If they were real, Penders owned nothing and was owed nothing. If they were fake, as Penders claimed, he owned the copyright to all of his work and Archie owed him significant compensation. Either Penders is lying that he signed those contracts, or someone at Archie knowingly forged his signature on a contract.
So each side begins making their case. Archie has Mike Pellerito, as well as a number of other executives and staff members, write affidavits testifying that even though the originals could not be found, the copies of Penders' contracts were not forged and that they had been found in the same filing system that contained hundreds of similar work-for-hire contracts.
I've seen people online just read the Archie side of the case and assume it's a slam dunk, because it absolutely seems like one.
But then Penders presents his side. Of course, Scott Shaw, yes, the exclamation point makes it into his legal filings, writes an affidavit swearing that Archie didn't require freelancers to sign work-for-hire contracts. Penders' early collaborator Mike Kantarovich says the same thing. Then, the 2 editors who Penders worked with before Pellerito, Scott Fulop and Justin Gabri, also write affidavits in support of Penders, testifying that Archie regularly did not get freelancers to sign work-for-hire contracts. Then, perhaps the most surprising person of all throws his weight behind Penders.
Creators' rights are very important to me, and I felt like, I'll just say in that moment I had to stand on the side of truth, and what I did.
That's right. Despite their differences, despite the feud, Bollers saw the legitimacy in Penders' fight and wrote an affidavit in support of him. In light of all this, Archie probably begins to see that Penders might actually have a case. Not a slam dunk, but a reasonable chance that a jury might find that Archie had been historically sloppy about getting contractors to sign work-for-hire agreements. It's a risk Archie's not willing to take. They settle their lawsuit and drop their case against Penders. And while we don't know the terms of that settlement, we do know what happened next.
As Flynn approached his 100th issue on the title, he was building towards a massive crossover, the conclusion of a deeply emotional arc that was going to take the book in all sorts of new directions. Of course, Flynn is worried about the lawsuit, but time and again, Archie reassures him, tells him that they're going to work it out. So he and his team keep working, keep building towards this grand moment, and then it all falls apart. In the settlement, Archie and Penders seem to have agreed to negotiate a license that would allow Archie to keep using Penders' characters, but for some reason, those licensing talks failed.
They had the ability to use the characters, okay? That they didn't was on them, and yet everybody was blaming me.
Art was already finished on some issues, and Penders' characters are just hastily removed. Flynn would ultimately be forced to reboot the series. The reboot that he had argued so passionately against 6 years earlier would finally come to pass. He had no choice in the matter. The beautiful, weird tapestry that had defined Archie Sonic, the weird mishmash of characters and ideas that had made the book so special, was over after 243 issues. Not only is Flynn devastated, but so is the fandom, who had grown and loved and been invested in these characters. And not only would Archie remove Penders' characters, but they would remove characters from all the other creators, including Bollers. Perhaps in that we can read some admission that they really didn't have signed contracts? We don't know.
This is a fascinating study into how fandom works, because what happens next functions almost like a Rorschach test.
When you look at this situation, you see a creator who had been taken advantage of by a big corporation, who's brave and clever enough to take the fight back to them, who, unlike so many who had tried before, actually succeeds. Or do you see a bitter artist who signed away his life's work and later came to regret it, abusing the legal system, boldly lying in court, vindictively destroying a beloved property and the work of his fellow creators just so he can get petty revenge and a payday? I believe Penders sees himself as the former, but the majority of the Sonic fandom definitely see him as the latter. While there had been plenty of vocal critics of Penders' writing and art prior to the lawsuit, from the time he started copywriting his characters, the Sonic community really turned on him. Perhaps he thought his legal victory might vindicate him, but the fact that he had now killed the Sonic universe only increased the vitriol. But Penders not only became public enemy number 1 for the Sonic fandom, he viewed one man as largely responsible for the treatment that he got: Ian Flynn. Ian's actions during the legal battle spoke volumes to me about his character. When Dan DeCarlo was going through his battle with Archie, I was publicly supportive of Dan, angering Archie's publishers to the point of kicking me off Sonic. Ian, on the other hand, was throwing me to the wolves. During the lawsuit, Flynn had gone out of his way to assure his fans that Penders had no claim, that his suit wouldn't go anywhere. As Flynn was the biggest celebrity in Sonic comics, his words had weight. Even speaking to Penders about this a decade later, it's clear just how much this hurt him.
Ian had been contacting me when he was a fan. He was looking for advice how to break in, and I was supportive of his efforts. and I saw comments made online, basically knocking my claims. People were taking whatever he was saying as the gospel truth. That annoyed me a lot.
Flynn, for his part, did eventually come to regret speaking out about this situation.
That was my own mistake, and I will own it. I wanted folks to be able to enjoy the book and to not worry as much. But eventually I just had to back off because I was not in the loop for some of the decisions, and the clarity and the comfort that I'm trying to bring is only bringing confusion. So it's better to just keep my mouth shut because it's not something I can control or really influence.
Whoever is to blame, by the end of the lawsuit, Penders, once the hero of the Sonic fandom, is now its villain. And being Ken Penders, proud, combative, he won't quietly disappear. He will argue, he will block, he will fight with anyone who comes at him online. And like most online arguments, this hardly helps Penders' public image. While Penders' goal often seems to just remind everyone of his importance in the history of Sonic, I feel like it's this period on Twitter that really cements the oft-repeated criticisms of Penders himself. That he's egotistical, that he's bitter, that he's arrogant, that he's just a regular old jerk. Unlike other controversial comic personalities of the 90s, Penders never seems in on the joke, never willing to laugh at himself and the criticisms about him. And because I have to mention it, in his most infamous tweet, Penders would complain that Sega wouldn't let him tell the story of the 20-year-old skunk taking the 15-year-old squirrel's virginity. That one's been discussed to death. I have nothing to add, and I'll leave it up to you if you want to go down that rabbit hole. Sorry, poor choice of words. It also doesn't endear him to the fandom that he regularly throws shade at Ian Flynn and his collaborators. You can decide for yourself if these are legitimate criticisms or just an extension of the personal enmity he felt because of Flynn's actions, but I'm curious how all this felt for Flynn himself. Here is this guy, a guy whose work you grew up on, who supported you when you were a fan, whose work is inexorably intertwined with your own, just constantly putting you down on Twitter. Maybe Flynn has thick skin, and maybe it's easy to write off Penders as just a guy with a grudge. I imagine it still hurts, but Flynn's not done. Flynn goes back into anime protagonist mode.
It got to a point where it's just kind of gotta tuck your head and keep at it, tell the best story you can, and hope that eventually stands on its own merit.
Remember, this is the guy who made 30-something fan comics, who spent 4 years pitching Archie to get a job. No one is going to take Sonic away from him. And so, in the wake of the lawsuit, without missing his beat, he and his collaborators restructure the book. They give an in-universe explanation for why all of Penders' characters suddenly disappeared. It's a bit rocky at first, but they fight on, and they make this new continuity work. Flynn works to prove, perhaps to the fandom, perhaps to himself, perhaps to Penders, that he can make a great Sonic comic even without Penders' characters. They succeed. Going into Christmas 2016, Flynn gets on a call with his editor. They celebrate the work they've done over the past year, the challenges they've overcome in building this new continuity, the excitement they have for 2017 when they'll reach the milestone issue 300. They hang up and get ready to enjoy their holidays. 2 hours later, his phone rings again.
He calls me back, incredibly upset because he just learned that Archie had lost the license. And that was it. That was all she wrote, and a terrible early Christmas present.
The Sonic comic is dead. After 25 years, Sega had pulled Archie's license to publish Sonic comics. Their journey was over. Flynn was unemployed. His stories would never be finished. His entire body of work, the past 10 years of his life, will go out of print. Why did Sega pull the license? Again, we don't know, but we can speculate. One thing seems clear to me. This was not Archie's choice. A tight-fisted company like Archie would not be paying for finished art on books they never expected to see print. In my experience, licensing agreements have very delineated timelines, so that wouldn't happen, which means Sega's cancellation was sudden. Why? Some people online blame Penders. Is that true? Well, we do know from the filings that Sega had renewed the license with Archie after Penders filed suit, so that part doesn't track. But maybe they're concerned that Penders still had outstanding claims because Archie had never properly licensed his characters. Could it all come down to Robo Robotnik? But there was another lawsuit against Archie around this same time. Scott Fulop, one of the early editors of the Sonic comic who had worked with Penders, also sued Archie, also claiming that his contributions were not work made for hire. Fulop's case didn't go anywhere because the statute of limitations had passed, but it's important to note that the judge did write in his decision that he had serious doubt that Archie had properly contracted Fulop as a work made for hire freelancer. Perhaps Sega was nervous that more creators might start coming forward in the wake of this. Maybe the sales just weren't good. We don't know, but what we do know is that the Sonic comic was dead and Ian Flynn was out of work. 2 days later, it was announced that Sega had given the license over to IDW, who'd be starting a new Sonic series with a new continuity starting at issue 1. Archie helped Flynn and his fellow Sonic creators out by getting them work on other Archie titles, but Flynn still had to wrestle with the idea of not only not being the one to write Sonic, but to read someone else writing him after a decade of steering that ship. I have to wonder if it crossed his mind that a decade earlier, Penders had had that same feeling about him. It seems like someone up there likes Flynn. And by up there, I mean Japan. And by Japan, I mean Sega. Because he gets the call. IDW wants him to pitch on the new Sonic series. Unlike the Archie series, Sega would be heavily involved in IDW's version of Sonic. And so Flynn was invited up to Burbank to IDW's headquarters to pitch his new take on a Sonic comic. But no one told him that Takashi Iizuka, the head of Sega's Sonic team, was going to be there in person. Flynn does his best to not act nervous and gives Iizuka his pitch. A few days later, it's announced the new IDW series would be written by Flynn with art by Yardley and their other collaborators from the Archie days. Their journey would continue on, but it wouldn't be a walk in the park. Sega had strict restrictions in place. No characters could be used from Archie, from the cartoon shows, or from any other media. Was this, perhaps, Sega of Japan's belated revenge on Sega of America, finally wiping out Sonic's American backstory? Whatever the case, Flynn has yet another challenge. He has to prove that he can write Sonic, this time with even less building blocks to play with. And once again, he steps up. He exchanges the soapy, lore-heavy Archie version for something action-packed and streamlined. It feels like a shonen manga with a brisk plot that builds big arcs that conclude with epic battles. It's so different from the Archie series, but great in its own way. Now, the story isn't quite over, so don't leave yet, but I do want to just take a minute to plug this book, because if you're looking to get into Sonic without reading 400 issues of Archie lore, IDW's made it incredibly easy. These books are available digitally or in trade paperback, but personally, I really like these oversized hardcovers IDW's been putting out, and I'll put links for everything down below. Back to our story, because Flynn isn't done yet. While he had written the Sonic comic for years, and he'd even written on the Sonic TV show, there was one more mountain to climb, one more dream he hadn't gotten to fulfill. His journey started, like so many others, as a kid playing a video game. And now, in 2022, it was announced that Ian Flynn would be writing the script for the new Sonic game.
I'd reached the mountaintop. I had achieved something I never thought I would. I wanted to be sure. There was always that dream of, now I've achieved writing for this comic that I've loved for so long. Wouldn't it be great if I could work on the games as well? And here I am.
That 7-year-old kid, playing Sonic with his brother, buying Penders Sonic comics at Walmart, had climbed the mountain. But where's everyone else? What happened to Ken Penders? After turning around Sonic, Mike Pellerito was made president of Archie Comics, and today is both Archie's president and editor-in-chief. Karl Bollers took some time away from comics to focus on the craft of writing, and a few years after he came back to the industry, he wrote the Eisner-nominated Watson and Holmes, and today is an editor at Oni Comics. And Ken Penders? Well, he's still Ken Penders, going on Twitter to complain about the Sonic movies and vaguely threatening to sue Paramount. But because of his legal victory, Penders is working on his own continuation of his work on Sonic. He's had to remove any references to works owned by Sega, so echidnas are race variants known as echidnias, but Locke and the gang will all be there. The first volume of the Lara-Su Chronicles is available for pre-order, finally nearing completion almost a decade after it was announced. But I like to think it's because Penders has been prioritizing spending time with his kids and his grandkids, being the kind of father he didn't have. The kind of father who looks just like his child, just with a different hairstyle. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please hit like and subscribe. If you want to learn more, I really recommend the blog Thanks Ken Penders, and I'll put a link below. A lot of people helped make this video possible. I want to thank Comic Drake, who shared his research from his Sonic video with me, as well as Ayaku Web, who helped me research Sonic in Japanese sources. Please subscribe to both of those channels. I also want to thank my brother, who's an attorney, who helped me get access and interpret a lot of these legal documents. And of course, I want to thank Ian Flynn, Ken Penders, and Karl Bollers for all taking the time to speak with me. And I want to thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you soon.